The second of our lectures in this inaugural sequence of Center for East Asian Studies lectures. And just a word or two. I'm director, Donald Harper, and of course that's not necessary because when I look around I recognize everyone. But I think it's nice to see the group here and to think how these CEAS lectures do provide I think a wonderful forum for bringing people from the field of East Asian Studies to University of Chicago, friends and colleagues, people we love to see, people we like to hear from, and to address a variety of topics that really, I think, show the ways in which our interest in and love for East Asia crosses various disciplines, crosses the regions, has a variety of cultural facets. That this lecture series, I think, will, starting with this inaugural year and moving into the future years of the CEAS lecture series, I think be a wonderful addition to what we do with the center. And it's wonderful to be able to have Professor Wai-yee from Harvard come and give our second lecture. And in order to do that, I would like to introduce Professor Fox to do the introduction.
I'll just project. I don't know if I need to use this.
No. And you shouldn't say too much.
Oh no, too bad. It is my privilege to introduce Professor Wai-yee Li. As many of you know, Professor Li is a scholar and teacher of Chinese literature at Harvard University. Professor Li is perhaps the rarest of scholars, one whose work is both deeply attentive and broadly ambitious. In an academic culture in which scholars increasingly stay in their own lane, Professor Li's work very deftly and brilliantly swerves, crossing large expanses of time and place, of genre and methodology, to ask important questions and to reframe and reinvigorate the debates. From her seminal book on the late imperial literary imaginary, Enchantment and Disenchantment, Love and Illusion in Chinese Literature, to her most recent monograph, Women and National Trauma in Late Imperial Chinese Literature, which, by the way, won the Levenson Book Prize this past year, Professor Li has explored the ways in which Ming writers negotiate the dialectics of self and other, reality and illusion, writing and action, literature and history. And of course, Professor Li's interest in the writing of history is not limited to the late imperial period. In her 2007 monograph, The Readability of the Past in Early Chinese Historiography, she turns to the Zhuangzi to ask how rhetorical form generates interpretive strategy and orders historical knowledge. In addition to these works, Professor Li has been involved as co-editor and co-author in a number of significant projects, such as the 2006 volume, Trauma and Transcendence in Early Qing Literature, the 2014 Columbia Anthology of Yuan Drama, and just this year, 2 new works, volume, the letter to An Martin's Legacy, as well as an annotated translation of the Zhuangzi. Professor Li has been the recipient of numerous prestigious grants and honors, from a junior fellowship in the Harvard Society of Fellows very early in her career, to her recent election as an academician at Academia Sinica. And if I may speak from personal experience, in addition to her own very impressive scholarly achievements, Professor Li is also a tremendously helpful, supportive, and generous advisor and teacher to many students. So please join me in welcoming.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Ariel, for this, I think, undeserved introduction. I feel very embarrassed about these introductions. Anyway, so thank you all very much for coming. It's a late afternoon thing, and I very much appreciate you being here. So I was not totally happy with this title, In Pursuit of the Genuine. The Chinese idea is 求真, so it's the word zhen and how to translate that word zhen, which is giving me a lot of anxiety. When I gave this talk in Chinese University of Hong Kong in the summer, you can kind of glide over a lot of these issues when you're speaking in Chinese, but as you can see, there are many ways you can render this word zhen in English, and each will have its different etymology and cultural historical context and can mean actually quite different things. I gave myself the permission to not stick to one translation depending on what I'm talking about when I'm talking about zhen. The cultural moments I'll be addressing will be mainly late 16th to mid 17th century, but if we have time, I would be going back to Zhuangzi at the end of the talk. So let me begin at the end with Gu Yanwu. So Gu Yanwu, some of you may know him, very important scholar in the 17th century, and in this compilation of his Yu Zhi Lu, which means something like the knowledge that you gain day by day, he has an entry on what's wrong with the final decades of the Ming Dynasty, or why the Ming Dynasty fell. He identified as a turning point in Ming moral decline. He identified that point as 1568, and in that year, the examiner, in his, the examiner can put out a chengwen, your model examination essay. In that model examination essay, he 破题用Zhuangzi. So he, in his opening segment of his examination essay, he has a kind of unconscious allusion to Zhuangzi, which includes the word zhen, and which gets Gu Yanwu off on an excursus on 五经无真字, that the word zhen does not appear in 五经. 许见老庄之书 and first appears in Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi and texts like that. So I did a search. Now we can do a search so quickly, right? So in truth, 五经无真字, the word zhen does not appear in 五经. It also does not appear in 论语 and 孟子 and 礼记. It appears in other places, but more of that later. So just in my original paper, I translated the whole passage from Gu Yanwu, and we won't go into all of that. It would just take too long. Just to cite some of his examples. So here he is citing Lao Tzu, and then Zhuangzi, where the word zhen appears. I think I won't dwell on this, but 大宗师, where the word zhen really means returning to your true state, means something like going to your pre-human or non-human state, and sometimes it just means death. So in 列子, it definitely means something close to death, 各归其真, to return to your true state, your pre-human state. And he also cites Xu Shen, where the word zhen is said to mean something like 仙人变形当仙也, right? 当天也. The word zhen, according to Xu Shen, means someone, some sort of immortal, changing his form and ascending to heaven. Let's not go over the rest. The rest is some 10th century commentator on Xu Shen. It's not crucial to the argument, so we can skip that. But just a minor point, because in order to get to that meaning, that the root meaning of zhen is an immortal changing his form and ascending to heaven, Xu Shen thinks that one of the roots of the character is this hua, which is the same as the character hua. But some modern scholars of 文字学, of which I may not count myself, so I'm just really quoting other people, think that it's not hua but bi. So this is Ji Xusheng. I don't know how well regarded he is among 文字学 people. He's a scholar from Taiwan. So he thinks that it's not hua as in transformation, but a spoon sticking, getting food from a cauldron. So so in other words, zhen is, according to this scholar, which I did not then go on to investigate whether he's right or not. So he's talking about this as kind of retrieving the original ritual that the word zhen may be associated with. It's, I would say, pretty common strategy in tracing. I'm not saying the etymology explains anything. I just thought we need to clear house and at least go through some of this. So to make a long story short, the reason why Gu Yanwu is so uneasy with the word zhen is because he thinks that, at least in his early instantiations, this is a word that has to do with something like transformation or death or becoming an immortal or transcending life or death or some sort of mystical experience. And in his explanation of the whole of his own thinking, he says that it's only later that the word zhen acquires this meaning of facts or reality or correspondence of name and actuality. So if we have time, we can talk about it more later, but I think zhen is actually quite different from cheng, the word that in modern Chinese you translate as sincerity. Also quite different from all these other writings in what we now call early poetics, talking about how when you have very strong emotions, you cannot but involuntarily burst out in song and dance and so on. So actually quite different from that kind of thinking. And if we have time, we'll go over that. So the reason why he thinks that this is, that the fact that this examiner uses the term zhen, by the way, I think I'll just, he uses the term zhen is because this shows that he is unconsciously being influenced by all the tendencies, that is heterodox and self-indulgent and so on, in late-Ming thought. And in his words, that on the surface they may be using 良知 as in 孟子, that this may sound something like 良知 or 气子, or things like that, but in fact it's very different. It's what Zhuangzi is talking about. In other words, some version of zhen that is about retrieving a core of yourself that is not immediately expressible or achievable, but you are trying to get to that core, and it's always a very problematic, tenuous quest, and so on. So he thinks that's what's wrong with the late Ming. That it is, in other words, the reason why the word zhen appears so often in late Ming writings is because they're looking for a version of inner truth or some form of genuine self-expression that has already deviated from Confucian thought. So part of what I will be trying to do for the rest of the time I have will be just going over some of the things that people write in the late Ming that may have some bearing on this debate. So that's where we have. Okay, so this is actually something I don't know much about because, but I thought at least I need to have a nod at those people. Okay, Wang Yangming and his followers. What do they mean when they talk about their true self or their true zhenwo, or the genuine me? They talk a lot about that, and they talk about it as some sort of the goal of moral self-cultivation, that this is something that you will try to get at, and it is important because this will be the source, that which is fundamental to moral self-consciousness. So they talk a lot about zhenwo, but, and Gu Yanwu, when he attacks them, he says something like 心可待求则非于我为义. The reason why you cannot trust 心学 is because if you can look at your sin or your true self, then you're not one with your true self. That you're already presuming self-division, and then you are looking for this thing, and you are not accepting what the sages say about how this is naturally part of your moral consciousness. Don't worry, we won't stay too long here because I feel very kind of sincere about this because I don't know this stuff very well. So I thought what is really interesting is that on the one hand, the vocabulary of the rhetoric of this moral discourse is all about your true nature flowing forth, right? 真性流行. And yet, the idea is that this true nature flowing forth, the reason why this can be a moral accomplishment is because when it is truly your moral nature, then you are unconsciously already fulfilling a moral precept. So if you look at the quotation, 小心翼翼朝夕上帝, that's from a Xi Jing poem that is talking about Wen Wang. So he said that if you can be like that, then you are 真自然, then your true nature is really flowing forth. So it's not really self-indulgent at all. So the reason why I brought all this up is because one of the things that is most commonly said about late Ming literature and culture is that 心学 and all its discourse has a kind of natural connection with the late Ming obsession with the self and all that. But if you look closely, it's actually very different. And one of the differences is that the moralists, if you would, the Xinxue scholars, they are really talking about this zhen and the center as a kind of core of, as a conscious quest, as moral impetus, as a natural fulfillment of prescriptions, whereas the literati, they are talking about something quite different. We can skip this. It's fine. It's really Zhuangzi talking about how do you get at that true core, and it will be like refining metal, refining ore so that you can get the true gold. So the metaphor is that of lian or 锻炼, of refinement. Whereas, so as I said earlier, what is most often said about late Ming culture, about Chinese culture from the mid-16th to the end of to the mid-17th century, is that this is an age of self-expression, of individualism, of romanticism. These are the cliches that you still find in all textbooks about literary history. And there's, I guess there's some truth in it, but is also a little bit problematic. So what I will go through is some textual examples of why celebrating genuineness can be so difficult, or what sort of paradoxes it lands you in. So the first example I'm giving you is from a very well-known poet and playwright, Xu Wei. And this is a rhapsody that he wrote in about 1551 or so, don't remember the date, but he was about 30 years old or something. He just failed the examination. He went home. And then he wrote this long piece on how he will not let his true self be impaired by this failure. And what I find interesting about this piece is that this piece is cited quite often in in literary history as an example of how Xu Wei is someone who really just signed on this true self and is a good example of it and so on. So that is true, but if you read the whole piece carefully, then it's actually a very funny piece, and he raises a lot of questions on what exactly is this true self? What is the connection between this true self and this corporeal person, this me whose hair is turning gray and so on and so forth? But instead of paraphrasing, I'll just let you read some of the poem. So this is, as you can see from the first line, Yuan Yao Da Wu, he is taking on the a line from Zhuangzi's Fu Pian. So kind of a riddle. There's this thing, and then he gives a whole series of attributes on how it's really paradoxical. Maybe that small, maybe it's that big. Comes, goes, gain it, lose it. And then at the very end, he said that, and this is the true shi wei zhen wo. Does that give you enough time to read the whole thing in Chinese and English? Okay. I don't want to have to read it. And then it goes on, but the context is actually quite interesting because he has failed the examination, he has come home, and his cousins are teasing him for turning gray, and they're saying that, well, how can you say that you are not letting external circumstances affect you, your hair is turning gray? And so they try to pull off his gray hair, and then because he's kind of short and very agile, so he escaped them. And so the end of the piece is about how, okay, so I'm turning gray, but maybe it's just kind of some heaven-endowed lack that I have, that at 32 I should look like 48. And, it's not because I'm really affected by these external circumstances. It's not really because my zhenwo is affected by what is external to me. And you cannot say that it's because I failed the examination that I'm filled with sorrow and so on and so forth. So, in other words, this piece has a few lines that can be excerpted as a kind of proclamation on an exaltation of the true self. It has a very funny context, a kind of argument about whether this is really my true self or not, or whether I can claim this as a true self if I'm so affected by external circumstances. And if you read the whole piece, it's actually pretty funny and not at all this exalted proclamation that is made out to be. So I would say that of all these late Ming writers, one of the very common things they share in common, one of the things they share in common is this idea that what is inside of me is not easy to express, and when I express it, I'm prone to be misunderstood, and the focus is often on what is inside coming out, whereas with the Sensual scholars, it's the opposite. It's about from the outside going in. I'm getting to some inner moral core. So these guys never talk about how do I get to the inner moral core. They're talking about something inside that the world is just not getting. So the focus is on the gap between self and society, almost always. So just to give you some examples that you are likely to know, like this is Li Zhi in his very famous essay, The Childlike Mind. So I would just, this is an essay in which he says that the most important thing is for us to recover the childlike mind. And he exalts the childlike mind as something that is pristine and untempered, unadulterated, and so on. But he begins by quoting his friend Zhao Hong. Zhao Hong, because Zhao Hong writes in the preface to the Western Chamber in 1582 that, and he has this line, 知者勿谓我尚有童心可也. Those who really understand this should not say that I still have a childlike mind. So if you look at that line, the childlike mind is a negative thing. Because Zhao Hong is thinking that other people think that I still have this childlike mind, but in fact, I don't. So the word 童心 in some cases actually do have a negative connotations. So for example, in Zuozhuan, there's a line about how Lu Zhaogong, he's already 19 years old, but at his mother's funeral, he still messes up his clothes. And it says, 昭公十九年有有同心. And that's why we know that he will end up in exile and so on and so forth. So there is, in other words, you can find passages where 同心 just means that you have not developed yet to the right stage. But Li Ji is saying that I'm overturning all that, and I'm talking about 同心 as something we should all uphold as great. But what I find interesting is that why does he quote Zhao Hong? So he quotes Zhao Hong as someone who is protesting that he is being misunderstood. And this theme of misunderstanding is actually recurrent throughout this piece, on how I try my best to review myself, but I'm still misunderstood. Sounds like the most teenage thing like you can say, right? Nobody understands me. So this is the famous passage that you probably all familiar with, that this is 绝假成真 and so on. So I won't read it. You can kind of read it quickly. And elsewhere, he also, so what is this 同心? What is this true self, and how is it different from what, for example, Sensual scholars talk about? So for one thing, he talks about a lot of things that are not admissible in moral discourse, such as loving beautiful things, loving sensual beauty, loving profit, and there's kind of, we're not sure whether this commentary is written by him, this commentary on 水浒传. He has a preface to 水浒传which we can authenticate, but the comment that circulates by his name is probably not by him. But that is the commentary that whenever Li Kuei kills someone, the commentator would say, zhen, this is true, this is real, this is for, zhen for, or something. So in other words, this is a version of genuineness that is talking about just something unbridled, and some outpouring of emotion and impulse. And at the end of it, he has this really interesting line. He said that, how can I get to have a word about writing with the true great sage, the one who has not yet lost his childlike mind, right? And the allusion is to this line in Zhuangzi. And as you recall, in that line in Zhuangzi, they're talking about what can language do. I mean, what would happen if you have to rely on the mediation of language, and yet language is supposed to be expendable. So this is where they talk about obtaining the meaning and forgetting the words, 得意忘言,得鱼忘全, getting the fish and getting rid of the fish basket, and so on. So what does it mean when he alludes to Zhuangzi like that? So when I was giving this talk in Chinese, there's a pun that kind of works, but it doesn't work in English. So Yan Quan is this is about the meaning and the words, but what Li Zhi is really, what he cares about is actually not that dialectic. It's about who has the right to speak. So Yan Quan actually doesn't make total grammatical sense in modern Chinese either, but never mind. So it's the idea of who has the authority, what does it mean to be so concerned about immediacy and yet to be so self-conscious, and to believe that this genuine core that defies external constraints, that what does it mean for it to so badly in need of external validation? So the whole essay is very, as you recall, is very polemical. It really doesn't talk about what that childlike mind is like. It talks about how that childlike mind will never be understood. And the tone is, throughout his arguing with these imaginary detractors of his essay, that he has to push back and he has to claim authority for his own version of what is self-expression. Oops. Now, where's that? Oh, never mind. So that will go. So there's another place where Li Zhi also goes into the problematic of what does it mean to be genuine, that I find quite interesting. And the example he gave is that of Shun and Xiang. So some of you will know that is an example from Mengzi. So as you remember, so Shun has an evil brother who's always trying to murder him and then take over his wives and property and so on. So in one of those murder attempts, Shun does not die, but then Xiang walks into the room and they have a conversation. And then Mengzi said that Shun seems to be in this state of equanimity despite his younger brother's murder attempt, and so Mengzi has a discussion with his disciple on whether Shun can truly empathize with his younger brother if his younger brother is trying to kill him. And Mengzi said that yes, of course he can empathize, and he said, 相忧以忧，相喜以喜. So when Xiang is filled with sadness, when Shun is the same, and when Xiang is happy, Shun is also happy. So he has total empathy, despite all the bad things that Xiang is trying to do. Okay, so Li Zhi picks a fight with Mengzi on this, and said the following. He said that, well, you know, if it is as Mencius said, then if he really doesn't know that Xiang is trying to kill him, then he's just stupid, right? And if he knows that Xiang is trying to kill him and he is still glad, then he's hypocritical, he's a bucheng. So I don't believe it. I think that is, to say that that Shun's gladness is fake, I think is justified. 非过瘾. But then he goes on to defend Mencius. He said that the reason why Mencius said that is because unless Shun wants to empathize with Xiang, he cannot 感化 his younger brother. He cannot get his younger brother out of this murderous intention. So in other words, when you talk about Shun's genuine gladness, you have to make a distinction between a genuine intention to be glad and a fake reaction of gladness, because his immediate reaction is fake, right? But the intention to be glad is genuine. So in other words, you can always get around this, but in other words, you can be focused on this issue of zhen, but you have to make a lot of distinctions on the levels of your consciousness in order to make this argument. So what does it mean then to make a distinction between your intention and your immediate reaction? Kind of your immediate reaction, your intuitive reaction, and your your intention. That takes us to the idea of self-division, and the period is full of very divided people. This happens to be the century that has a lot of writings that are broadly defined as autobiographical. This is something that Wei-yee wrote about already a long time ago, and I know Judy wrote a book review of that. And so you have a lot of this kind of writings, and in a lot of the times the themes would be transformations, inconsistencies, contradictions, and the difficulty of judgment. So for example, inscription on your own portrait, the most common thing you say on the inscription of your portrait is that I don't know why this is me, or why is this me? I was once fat and then thin and now I'm fat again, so which is the real me? Or, you know, so the bafflement is the most common pose in such writings, because you want to say, I don't understand, and therefore I'm something grander that encompasses all these contradictions. I mean, that's not always the implicit argument, but I think sometimes that's the argument. So just to give you some examples, Xu Wei has some of this you may know. So for example, in Xu Wei's tomb inscription for myself, he goes into this discussion of what is the real me, because he lived for most of his life as a secretary. He was writing things on commission, right? So what does it mean if I have to write on behalf of another person? What room is there for me to be me? And so what is the distance between articulations and a person? So Li Zhi's Zhuangzi, for example, he invents an interlocutor whose name can mean a big lie or a great truth. There's no time to explain that pun. And this interlocutor doesn't really get Li Zhuangzi, and Li Zhuangzi has to explain things back and forth to him many times, and he presents that kind of dramatic back and forth as the stuff of what he is about. And Chen Jiru's tomb inscription for himself, he invents the story of his own death, and how that death is the story of his life, but it's a very fanciful elaboration, needless to say. Zhang Dai, I thought you guys would know, because I think Steve Owen translated it, where he looks back on his life and also is trying to make sense of it, of course with a lot of regret and with not a little pride, but also presenting the retrospection as a process rather than an accomplished fact. And that's very important to emphasize that in all these quests to get at that zhen wo, they always basically concede that I don't get it. And that is a very important conceit. And it's, of course, it's because of that this period talks so much about flaws and deviance and obsessions. Obsessions, of course, Judy here wrote an essay about this a long time ago, which we all cite. And so, for example, Zhang Dafu, he talks about how he calls himself 病居士, the person who's sick, because you have to be sick in order to be qi, filled with wonder, and only then can you be zhi, and excellent, and only then can you your name be passed on. And Yuan Hongdao, talking about his brother's writings, he said, of course my brother writes very well, and there are all these good things about his writings that I can enlarge on, but I want to talk about the flaws in his writings, because it's only in the flaws of his writing that he shows who he really is, his 本色, where he shows his true originality is in his flaws. And I thought this too is very interesting because, again, this is something that like we accept as a cliche almost, that the late Ming is full of very obsessed people, and that shows how genuine they are. But it's actually a very complicated psychological process. So, this also everybody cites because very memorable. So everybody cites it. It's in Wai-yee, and a lot of people know this quotation, right? That anybody who has no pi just has no deep feelings. Anybody who has no flaws has just no zhenqi, no true spirit. The reason why obsessions is tricky, or because when you're obsessed with something, it assumes a kind of oneness of goal, right? That yourself and the object of your obsession, there is a unidimensional, intense connection between these two things, and that's what you're about. But in all the writings about obsessions, again, the theme of self-division actually creeps back in. And I think the key is this word "ji." That's why I put it in red, the lodge. Because, well, first of all, Judy also cites this passage in her article. So this passage is quite well known, and this is from a book on flower arrangement by Yuan Hongdao Pingshi. And first of all, you notice that when he talks about these different obsessions, he's actually talking about quite different things, okay? Because Jikang in his iron, whatever, forging, you can interpret that as political resistance, because that's when Zhonghui, the aristocrat Zhonghui, coming to see him and he pretends not to see him. So it's just not that Jikang is obsessed about that necessarily, but that he wants to show defiance to Zhonghui. Or in the case of Li Zan and Mi Fu, then it's about artistic genius, sometimes it's about connoisseurship. In the case of Wang Wuzi and horses, it's about something else, it's about empathy. So first of all, the word obsession is used to talk about many different kind of mental states. And when you say ji, it means to stay in some place temporarily. It means that you can go back. When you're obsessed with something, you don't go back. Theoretically, that's, you kind of, right? You can drop in. But ji is, you are keeping a distance, you have a measure of self-observation, you're trying to retain control. So Yuan Hongdao is saying that how in all these cases, that they're just using this as a kind of a way to express their uncompromising, distinct, soaring spirit. Which means that the point is really not this obsessions, right? But this qi that is behind it. And then there's also this quote, which also appears in Judy's essay, just to remind all of you to go back to read it. This is Feng Monglong's comment on Tan Gai. I mean, his own comment on something that he wrote when he talks about how all these talk about being obsessed with the object is really Wu Ai Wu, is about a person obsessing with himself. So in other words, in all these obsessions, there is not only the desire to control the obsession, there's also a measure of self-regard or jishang, self-observation or self-celebration that is implicit in it, which seems to me all fair game, actually. So we can look at all that. And then there's also the question of whether when someone is zhen, is it a question of some true core manifesting itself outside, or whether it's something from without. So this is Qian Xianyi, very famous late Ming early Qing poet, writing in a letter to Yuan Zhongdao, the youngest of the Yuan brothers, Yuan Zhongdao in his younger days was very much into wine and women and all that, and in his later days decided to become a Buddhist. So in his letter to Qian Qingyi, he sounds almost regretful that such is the trajectory of his life. And Qian Qingyi said, actually, what do you know? Maybe that's really you. Because a person can be hunchbacked and then look like he's very respectful, and as a result develop true respect. 因语成功，遂成真功. So you may think that you're a very self-indulgent person, but maybe the inner Buddhist has been there all along, and you're forced to assume the pose of the Buddhist, and therefore you become a true Buddhist. So I cite this because a lot of the so-called self-indulgent late Ming literati, and there's a lot of them, very often later in their life look back and say that, well, maybe that was not totally right or something. So Yuan Zhongdao is one of them. But also this becomes one of the ways they then talk about what does it mean to look for that zhenwo again. So is that all the late Ming examples that I'm giving? Right. So it's just to sum up so that we can have some time to talk about Zhuangzi. When we look at late Ming writings now, I think it's very hard to not have some sort of to indulge in the kind of hermeneutics of suspicion and look at them and say that why do they think they're so cool? Kind of, because they have this kind of celebrating themselves mode, right? And we, as moderns, maybe because our life is sometimes so miserable, we look at them and say that, well, there is some sort of pretense there. There is, bad faith perhaps. They're just trying to look genuine. When you try to look genuine, already not genuine. Anyway, when you try to be transcendent about the true me, like Xu Wei, you're actually talking about some rather mundane circumstances, such as your cousin trying to pluck your gray hair, or when you talk about, and is it an accident that all this comes into being in the great age of drama, when everything is about performance and audience? Does it not instill some awareness of performing your genuineness into the consideration? And when it comes to obsessions, does it not mean that what seems a kind of self-evident manifestation of what you obsess with can be actually a question of hidden constraints and hidden aspirations and so on? So this is just by way of summarizing some of the things we talked about earlier. And I guess I could also just end the talk here, but what I wanted to do was to go back to what Gu Yanwu was saying, whether all this comes from Zhuangzi. Now, when you do that, it's actually a very problematic proposition. First of all, Gu Yanwu doesn't care about these people. Okay, he was not criticizing people like Yuan Hongdao or Xu Wei or whatever. He doesn't care about them. He's criticizing Xinxue and Wang Yangming and his followers. Among the women, the only one he really singles out to criticize is Zhuangzi. So in some ways, their antics are kind of beyond the pale for him. Okay, he doesn't even think that they're worth addressing. Okay, so he's talking about the pitfalls of zhen as far as the Xinxue people and other people are concerned. But that's not the only problem. As I said, Gu Yanwu has other targets. So what sort of justification does one have for also bringing Zhuangzi into this, aside from saying that, well, one can always profit from reading Zhuangzi again, right? But okay, you can say, for example, that everybody I mentioned earlier wrote a Zhuangzi commentary. They're not the only one. Anybody who matters wrote a Zhuangzi commentary by then, okay? So is that a reason to bring them together? I'm sorry, the answer is no, because in their Zhuangzi commentary, they're really boring. They just praise Zhuangzi for being transcendent and taking you to this space of freedom and so on. They don't talk about their self-division. They don't think all this anxiety has anything to do with Zhuangzi. So their commentary is not going to help you. I'm just saying. But still, one doesn't give up. So one look at the things that are talked about in Zhuangzi. So to kind of keep this under control, I would just say, let me see how to summarize this succinctly. First of all, I think that this idea of a zhenwo that term doesn't appear in Zhuangzi, but the zhenjun or zhenzai, that term, or even zhen, or even some version of transcendence, I think is much more fraught in the first 7 chapters as compared to the later chapters. I think in the later chapters, when this term zhen or zhenjun comes up, zhenwo comes up, or zhenren comes up, then is is closer to what we think of as a state of freedom or transcendent state. But in the early chapters, I feel that it is something that is brought in as a rhetorical necessity to talk about a problem, like some contradictions that we cannot resolve, some dialectics that we set in motion but we cannot arrest. So let's just as a placeholder put that zhenzai or zhenjun there. So to kind of explain this more clearly, let's look at some of the passages that I think you will know. So since you will know this, so you can speed read this, okay? This is Qiuren, so just read it quickly. So actually I will also read it with you so that you make sure. So if you look at this passage, for example, that so there may be a true ruler, but we don't quite know what it is about. And then there are all these components of our person, what should be the hierarchy in these components of person? Which is the zhenjun, which is the true self? So to show mercy on you, I'll give you the translation. Actually, rather faulty translation, but never mind. You will kind of get the feeling. So, this 非彼无我，非我无所取. So without that, there's no me. So what does that be? Commentators argue about that a lot. So some of them think that it's 自然, some of them think it is Wai-yee, some of them think it is some sort of activating force for the self. But whatever. So there's war, and then there's something else which set this war into motion. But what is it? And then what is the science for it? What if we don't know what its form is, although it truly 有情而无形, there's truth but no form. And then he goes into all these components of your body, your bones, your apertures, your 6 organs, 6脏 and so on. And 无水以为亲, to which should I be kin? Do I take pleasure in all of them? And if I want to own some of them more than other parts, am I showing partiality? Do I translate political hierarchy into the hierarchy of the person, the Junchen or Chenjie, which is the... And then what is interesting to me is that this passage actually ends in a rather dark note. So he introduces these terms like zhenzai and zhenjun, but it's not as if it's an answer. It seems to be just, as I said, as one of the steps in a cognitive process when he's trying to figure out what the ultimate meaning is about. And the end is about death and obliteration, right? 七星化, right? The form changes, 七星与双. 可不会 die, who is not this a great sadness, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, when we talk about zhen in Zhuangzi, I feel that we're not so much talking about its paraphrasable meanings, although we can talk about that, and I think we can talk about that more in the Wai Pian. But in the Nei Pian, I feel that it is indeed more a question of what rhetorical function it serves in some quest for some ultimate truth that cannot be articulated. And then it is very often associated with misunderstanding, oblivion, and death. And in general, the whole discourse on what looks like transcendence in those early chapters is very much connected to mortality. None of this is really original. I'm sure some of you have thought of that before. And then he also talks about zhenren. This is from Da Zong Shi, where he starts by saying, how can we be sure that we actually know anything? Because knowledge has to depend on something, but that which it depends on is 特为定也, but it's not fixed. And so it starts with a conundrum that he cannot answer because knowledge cannot be for certain. But then he posits something hypothetical. And I guess that's what I'm getting at, that a lot of the talk about zhenren in these early chapters is merely hypothetical. So when in order to answer this question, 何谓真人, what is a true person, he goes through a series of negations and implied conditionals and what may look like a genuine semblance, and then a lot of very paradoxical combinations without really answering the question. And of course, as you know, in Zhuangzi, there are a lot of these interlocutors and mediators. He's never really telling you straight what he means, and then the truth is always hidden. And a lot of passages about communicating some zhen that does not get communicated. Let's skip the dogs and horses. It's not essential to the argument. That's from Xu. I just don't want to try your patience too much. Oh, so, and then as I said, that in the other chapters, in the later chapters, this is actually much more straightforward. So in this passage, for example, it's really straightforward because Confucius meets the fisherman, and the fisherman tell him that he's just getting it all wrong. And Confucius said, "So may I ask what is zhen?" And the fisherman said that zhen is jing chen zhi zhi ye. So it's actually, let's get to the translation. Jing chen zhi zhi. It's the intent of essence and sincerity. And if you don't have that 不能动人, then it's not possible to move others. And then he goes on. So in this passage, for example, it's really straightforward. Then zhen is about correspondence of emotions and expression. And this is actually sounds extremely familiar. It could be in some treatise on literary expression, for example. And it's very straightforward, and it's very unlike, I would say, some of the earlier passages that we have seen. So to go back to our late Ming guys, okay, so very often when people talk about Zhuangzi and late Ming thought or late Ming culture, the equivalence is set up in a very simple way, which is that Zhuangzi talks about not perverting your true nature, your zhen xing, okay, and then of course in the late Ming that's what everybody talks about. For example, Li Mongyang, a classicist, actually not an advocate of the new style and so on, a classicist, who said that the reason why true poetry is among the people is because zhen is where this is the origin of the voice. And then people like Feng Monglong, Zhong Xing, Yu Hongdao, and Tang Xianzu talks a lot about zhen xing and zhen qi and so on. So that would be the kind of equivalence that's set up. And my little thought on this matter is simply that I think the equivalence lies elsewhere. That, in other words, that in Zhuangzi, as well as in a lot of these late Ming people, you actually come close to something that is like irony, that talks about how looking for this zhen is so fraught that you always need a mask to tell the truth, and you always want to strike that pose that you're encompassing contradictions. You talk about genuineness as something to be performed rather than something spontaneous, and often you're talking about a kind of epistemological uncertainty that you are not sure what you're getting at, but is something like your true self. And what I'm trying to say is that I think Zhuangzi is probably the first time that we're really pushing this idea of inwardness into some realm of the absolute. And because it's posited as such that it comes with a sense of limits. And it's really for the first time, because there's interiority in Mengzi and Zhongyong too, but there's not the same sense of limits. And because of that, it's very inspiring for later writers, because a lot of our late Ming guys, I think, are still imbibing from that tradition. So, okay, so there's a lot of problems with this presentation. I'll just tell you what are the problems. One is, there's Zhuangzi and there's late Ming guys, right? So what happened in the middle? So what happened in the middle? So that's one question. I thought of, should I write a section on the 6 dynasties and then whatever. Maybe I will write a section on the 6 dynasties. I don't know whether I'm qualified to do that, but or you can give me some thoughts on that. The second is, second problem is why? I mean, what happened in the Ming? Is there something you want to hypothesize about historical conditions, about what are the different factors that would be conducive to this type of confluence? You want to give a historical explanation or a theoretical explanation. So I'm just saying, I haven't quite figured all this out, so this is thankful for your indulgence in listening to me.